Are we in a silent depression? And if so, how long is this thing going to last? Let's go ahead and break it down. Now, by most measures, if you are talking to economists, like myself, you would say that the economy is fine, but people are still complaining. And when we talk about the economy being fine, what are we really looking at? Well, for example, inflation was 9% and now it's around 3%. If I'm looking at unemployment, which is something that we look at to see whether or not we're in a recession or where the economy is as a whole, we're near 4%, which is near a 50-year low. And then if I'm looking at just how people are feeling about the economy and spending, we spent $12 billion, which was a record for Black Friday. So if you're looking at those numbers, you're saying, hey, the economy is fine. If I'm looking at GDP, gross domestic product, that has grown too. The economy has expanded. So again, if you're looking at the numbers, you're saying, hey, we're fine, right? Inflation is going in the right direction. There is no recession. There is no depression. However, that is not how people feel. And there are really three statistics that I pulled that really illustrate why people feel the way that they do. The first one is this. Prices since 2019, just general prices across the board, are up 20%. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. When you talk to economists and we talk about how inflation changes from month to month, we are looking again from month to month and from year to year. So for example, we're looking at October of 2022 and going all the way to October 2023. And we're just comparing those two things across the board. And that's it. We say, hey, inflation went up by 3%. And then we compare it to January from last year to now, it was 9%. And we are seeing inflation start to slow down. That's one way to look at it. However, if you're looking at point to point, so from 2019 to where we are right now, that's a 20% increase, and that is not normal, and it certainly is not fun. And that is a part of the issue because prices do increase over time. I remember the dollar menu. It ain't here no more, right? However, this is a stark increase. It is something that is a sharp increase as well that's a little jarring because you remember 2019. You remember how cheap or inexpensive things were, and now you know it's like, hey, wait a minute. This just don't feel the same. My paycheck has not caught up, but things get a little worse here too. That is because groceries, food across the board is up 26% since 2019. And the worst stat here, at least the worst stat that I pulled, or I think is the worst one of the three, is that housing has increased 47% just from 2019. And as you know, for most people, that is taking up the vast majority of their income. From the take-home income, it is obviously going to housing. So 47% increase in just keeping a shelter over your head, and then 26% just to feed yourself just over the last few years. And then you throw in the fact that we are at a record high number for credit card debt, and student loan payments have hit all during this time. That is why people feel like it is a silent recession, or a silent depression rather. Here's the problem. We don't actually have a textbook definition for a silent depression. There isn't one. It's just a trendy term that people use to get clicks and to go viral on TikTok. Now again, these feelings are real. These feelings are definitely real, but one of the issues here is the fact that from an economist perspective, from a government perspective, from a university perspective, when they pull together all these pieces of data, they're primarily looking at what we call the aggregate, the entire economy, and that is the best way to measure some parts of the economy. The other part of this is when we're talking a silent recession or a silent depression, that's mostly how you feel as an individual, which is relatively subjective, right? I could argue that there's always been a silent depression among those who are at or near poverty. That would be true, right? Because they are in a very different situation than what everybody else is into. If you are someone who is making $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a year and you don't notice any of these increases, you may not feel that way at all, right? So it's really coming down to the individual, which is not always the best way to measure the entire economy. But what I will say is this, and this is perhaps the thing that again makes people feel much worse than what the numbers are saying right now. So if we're going back and comparing where we were in the 1930s as a whole versus where we are here, here's one stat that does stand out, and I'm going to give you an asterisk here as well for this one. So back then in 1930, the average pay was about $4,800. Now, if you take that $4,800 and let's say that we are, increasing and everything is fine and things are equivalent, then the average pay for Americans should be about $85,000 today. That is not the case. That is not the case. The average pay for Americans right now is $56,000. So it's going to feel, and this is all adjusted for inflation, obviously, that is going to feel like, wait a minute, we are behind where we were in the 1930s, and all of these prices are increasing at the same time. We're not in the best of shape for individuals. And that is an argument that you could make. I would also argue that, remember, back then in 1930, during the Great Depression, what was the unemployment rate back then? The unemployment rate was 25%. Even in the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009, the unemployment rate back then was 10%. Again, we are right under 4% today. Okay, as of today, we're still right under 4%. So that is how the entire economy looks. And remember, in the 1930s, not everybody had a job in the way that we do today, meaning African Americans weren't getting paid at all in some cases, or you're in a sharecropping situation, something crazy. Women couldn't work. There are a lot of asterisks there, right, on how they calculated the number back then versus where it is today. But I would still argue that the majority of people are underpaid and the economy has absolutely changed. But again, we don't have a strong definition for what a silent depression is to really name it. And what happens here, especially when you're watching videos on TikTok or you're reading threads on X or Twitter or whatever it is that you want to call it, what happens is they get the feelings right. They don't always get the facts right. Okay, so they get the feelings right where it's like, hey, you are being underpaid and things are more expensive, which is true, but is it truly a depression? That's not the case. Even when we saw a lot of those tech layoffs this time last year, we pulled the numbers, right? And back then we found that the tech sector, for the people who are working in tech, they only represent about 2% of the entire workforce. Now, that's not to lessen the impact or the severity of what that was for those people in those spaces, but tech doesn't really make up that much in terms of workforce, though it does make up a lot of the stock market in and of itself, which we have talked about on the channel before. So here's the thing. Here's what you need to know and what you need to do about this, okay? Right now, the main thing is prices are rising a lot faster than your income. And as always, there are really two ways that you can attack this, and you probably know on what side of this equation that I'm going to fall on. You can cut your expenses. You can do that. That's difficult to do. Okay, I say it's difficult to do because, again, if rent is up 47%, if housing is up 47%, if you're getting a mortgage or whatever, and you know that interest rates are higher, right? They almost doubled if I'm not mistaken. That's hard to do. Okay, it is very difficult to cut down on an expense that's up 47% for everybody across the board. There was a notion 5, 6, 7 years ago is you could just eat at home and save money. Well, when food is up 26%, you can't do that in the exact same way. And you got to eat and you got to live. So there's that, right? And then you got student loans if that's the case. It's only but so much. All right, it's only but so much. So I would argue that the other side of the equation is to find ways to make more money if possible. Now, for some people, it's going to say, well, yeah, sure. If I could do that, or if I knew how to do that, then I would do that already. Fair. But that's the situation that we are in right now. And until inflation starts to really fall off or we get deflation, that's really the only way to get around that. I would argue, though, that there are some ways to significantly increase your income outside of side hustles in terms of switching jobs. If you are in a position to do that, I would look to do that. That's the fastest, I wouldn't say most reliable, but it's the fastest way to increase your income, because staying in a job, you're only going to get a 2 to 3% increase per year, depending on where you are. When you are switching jobs, you can start to see $10,000 or $15,000 increases by going from job to job. Yes, there are risks to doing so. Okay, there are risks to doing so. You got from one job, that job starts doing layoffs. Okay, you can have switched jobs 6 months ago. You might not want to switch again, right, for at least another 18 months or so. But that is one thing that I did to increase my income from jump to jump, and is one thing that has been quite successful for others as well. So that's one thing you can do. And also, I've done an entire video on what I felt were some of the best side hustles and alternate streams of income that you can add on top of your current income. And that is something I would look forward to as well. And then obviously, here on the channel, we talk about investing. It's another way that you can increase your income income and increase your overall wealth. If you want to check out those videos on making more money, side hustles, and investing, then you want to check out these videos right here.